Hi, this is Lainey Cameron. I am so excited to be here with Noué Kirwan because this book, people are chatting about it. I love that it's women's fiction, but it's got that romance and friendship angle, kind of second chance romance, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yes.
I'm jazzed that we're going to talk about this. So let's start with where are you joining me from today?
I am in my living room in New York City, Harlem, New York.
Love it. And let's start with the book, Long Past Summer, and have you tell the listeners a little bit about it because they might not have had the chance to read it yet.
Okay, well, it's as you said, it's a contemporary romance, women's fiction romance. It's about a woman named Michaela who comes from a small town in Georgia, and had big aspirations as a teenager to make her mark in New York City. And she comes and she does. I mean, she finds that it's a little more difficult than she expected it to be. And right when she's right on the precipice of all that she's, kind of dreamt for herself, her ex from when she used to live in her little Georgia small town comes back into the picture and kind of shakes up everything.
And I love that you kind of took the personal aspects and then made them hit her in her professional life. I thought that
Mm,
was really interesting. I did a similar thing with my first book. And what I like about that is, people tend to think that romance or women's fiction books have to be about the home and domestic life, and they can't be
mm,
around our professional lives. And I love that you showed that, like, her professional life is everything to her, right?
yeah.
She's really like, what's the past tense of striven? Worked really hard
Yes.
to get to get where she is. Me, a writer, me, really. But yeah, I loved how you kind of set it all in that professional domain. So you've got all these impacts of the friendship coming back and the past love, but set in this world where it's affecting her professional career. I thought that was really clever.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It just kind of happened organically. I mean, I think I thought about, I guess, myself and what might like upend my life, and I knew that, someone affecting my career would, shake me up a little. So,
And that's always one of my favorite questions is tell me a little bit more about the inspiration for the novel. Where did the original seed of that idea come from? And did you bring different things together?
yeah, it was a ton of different things. Like I'd always kind of wanted I've always had like a love-hate relationship with like small town romance, just because, like, I, as a city dweller, I've lived in small towns, but or small-ish towns, and but I'm from New York. And I used to the small town life is very nice, and knowing everyone is very nice. And but there's this impression that that only the dwellers of small towns are like salt of the earth type of people, and that like city people are different or more cutthroat, and that can be true. But then you also have a situation where you not like your neighbors, or your neighbors know you, and that sort of thing, even in a city. Like, it can happen in apartment buildings even.
Right.
And so I wanted to tell us like one of those small town love stories, except that not have like the careerist woman go back to her small town and discover her old love. I wanted it to like kind of be the inverse of that, where her old love comes to the big city and she rediscovers love. So
Well,
that
I
was
love that. Yeah, one of my things that drives me crazy if you watch like Hallmark movies is, the big career woman goes home for Christmas. It's always Christmas, right? There's
exactly, yeah.
snow and there's sleigh bells, and she goes to her small hometown. And by the end of the movie, she gives up her entire life for the guy and opens a cupcake shop when she used to be a lawyer.
Exactly.
And I'm like, come on, why is she selling cupcakes? Why does she have to sell cupcakes?
Exactly. No, that's exactly, that was like one of the seeds of it, was exactly like, I love Hallmark movies, have watched them forever, but I was definitely like, I wanted to be the inverse of that. Definitely like the inverse of that. So that was like the first little nugget. And then another little nugget was, there's a song by Aretha Franklin, um it's an old song from the 80s that but used to always make me so sad, and it was about it's Aretha Franklin's character singing from the point of view of a girl who got left behind in her small
Mm.
town by this love, like her first love. And I was like, how would that be if it was gender swapped? If it was the guy who got left behind in their small town for a girl who went off and did her own thing. And I was like, I like that too. And it, and then there were other things that came together, and I was just like, and it started germinating, and it had its first like inclination and incarnation, and then it kind of developed and snowballed into a book.
I love this. And it's interesting because this one came to my attention because one of my personal friends and favorite authors, Lynn Liao Butler, actually like pinged me about it. She was sharing it on, I think on Instagram or something. And I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And one of the things that Lynn and I kind of were discussing is this women's fiction or romance? And Lynn felt very strongly that this is women's fiction because your main character is learning and going through that emotional arc and changing over the course of the book. Can you tell me a little bit about like what is her journey? Like, don't give any spoilers, don't tell us the
Okay.
end of the book, but like what does she have to learn? Like what is she going to struggle with as we watch her over the course of this novel?
I think she struggles with what the requirements of love are, because I think she starts the book thinking that it's something that will impede other things. And I think as she moves through the book, she kind of is learning that, it's a give and a take. And it's also, but learns also to kind of forgive herself for thinking that she had to either have it right at the outset, or it was never going to happen for her. And like, and I think a lot of times for women in general, there's this feeling that like time's passing and you have to get on it, like those personal aspects of your life, you have to get on it, and it's like bad or something to wait until it's right or it works, like just the clock is ticking and your
Right.
ovaries or whatever.
I can
So
relate,
yeah.
yes. And I'm going to read a little bit of a quote from two people, actually. Well, one is Kirkus Reviews, because I thought they said something really interesting. They said that you captured really well the sense of what it's like to grow up with absent and deceased parents, as well as the pressure on Black professionals to outperform or overperform while conforming to white norms. And I think this is really interesting because you also see it in many immigrant stories in women's fiction, where there's this sense of like parental and also like just obligation to do better or to try harder because you're trying to prove not just yourself but an entire generation in the case of immigrants, or an entire like class in the case of race of people. Like you're not only performing for you, you're performing for everyone. And that's such a mental pressure on us as humans.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was really interesting that that's what Kirkus picked up on in your book. And by the way, Kirkus Reviews, if anyone's ever read them, they are the hardest thing to get them to say something nice about your book, and they say lots of nice things about your book here, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And then the second review that really struck me was by someone who's been a guest on the podcast before, who I love to death, Jamie Beck. She's also a great supporter of other authors.
Yes.
And I love how Jamie
Absolutely.
talks about how, just like her books, she says it's all about family, friendships, and romantic love, how our childhood influences our perception, and how discrimination impacts women trying to strike a balance between their own ambitions and their personal relationships. And so you got a lot of complex topics that you're dealing with here in this book. Did you think that people would pick up on all of those things when they started to write about and review your book? Like, did you set out to write about all these different things, or was it more like that's what came out and then people saw it in a way that was maybe different to how you saw it?
I think I in some respects I feel like the racial aspect of it is just the way it is for me and for my the other women in my life, women of color in my life. Like that's just the way it is, and that it kind of resonated so loudly when I just meant in some respects for it to just be like kind of the status quo of her life, because it's the status quo of a lot of our lives. And I wanted it to be I wanted the character Michaela to be identifiably Black in the ways in which a black woman would see herself, or a woman of color would see herself, while I'm still telling a very universal story about love and second chances and that sort of thing. But I definitely didn't want you to feel like you could pick Michaela up and take her out and put someone else in there and it would be the exact same story. Now, women do have, in that respect, women of all stripes have very similar professional like issues in terms of like what the expectation is and how they have to perform or overperform and that sort of thing. But I always feel like black people and people of color in general have that extra added like thing where they they represent black people or Latinx people or Asian people in every room that they come into, that every space. So if they have a high, that's yay black people, and if they have a low, it's like, oh well, what did you expect? And so I really wanted to say that and make sure that that was seen. But I didn't expect, so that to your question, I didn't expect that it would resonate so highly with so many people. Like I didn't see that I didn't foresee that like coming through so clearly. And in terms of the family dynamics, I just thought that, you know they say sometimes that like hurt people. And so I wanted to kind of play with that a little bit. And so I think that part I knew people were going to see, and like they would recognize possibly themselves or possibly someone that they knew in that. But yeah, the racial aspect was kind of in the workplace was a surprise.
That makes perfect sense to me. It's like the context of the world she's living in. And that's part of what the joy of fiction is that you get to share that context with people who didn't live it, right? So me, a
Yeah.
white woman, I get to read that book and I'm like, oh, I never lived that life and I'm not going to live that life. But that context makes it so much more interesting as a
Yes.
journey, but also as a learning experience when you read a novel that has a different background to yourself.
Yeah. I like that a lot because it feels like the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. It's like you get
Right.
this really great story, but then you learn something and you almost didn't even realize that you learned something. You're like,
Right.
oh, at the end of that, like I have greater empathy because I was able to put myself in this position in this person's story that is not my story and that normally I would not, I wouldn't identify with.
To me, that's one of the great joys of reading. It's probably
Yeah.
the one reason I read is being able to experience others' lives
Yeah.
differently, right? Like fictional people, but everybody's coming from real life experience somewhere, right?
Yeah, there's a nugget of truth in all of it. Yeah.
Right. So did it change a lot as you were editing it? This is your debut novel, right?
Yes.
So like from the first version, I imagine it must have changed a lot. Most people's debuts do. Did it change a lot? And what might readers be interested to know is different from maybe some of the original versions?
Well, it evolved, I would say, as opposed to like changed exactly. It was like it matured, I would think, because like from where it started really as it started as a story about Michaela, the main character, as a young woman. And then it kind of evolved to where it was like 50% her as a young woman and then 50% her as an adult, and then slowly it changed until it was like 60 or 70% her as an adult and 30% her as a young woman. So that that kind of changed. And as a result, actually, almost every instance that they reference, the characters reference in the past, actually has a scene that I wrote for it in the past that in a lot of ways got in a lot of instances got cut out. And so they only talk about it and you don't actually see it. There are a lot that you do see, but there are a lot that you don't see. And they exist. Like I have them, that the reams and thousands of words that I have.
So, so how much does a really avid reader have to bribe you to get one of those scenes that were never released?
It would have to be a letter writing campaign to get those, because some of them were really rough.
Well, let me ask you about like your editing process. Like, what does that look like?
So generally speaking, I'm a person who needs to constantly edit, and I'm constantly revising even as I'm writing. So what ends up happening is I read up to where I am and then continue. And as I'm reading, I'm correcting things. So it doesn't it like draft one morphs into draft two, which morphs into their not solid drafts. It's not like I have one draft and then I work on the next draft. It's always like draft 1.2, draft 1.3, draft 1.4, and then we get up to draft 2, and that's kind of how it flows. Like I by the time I was ready to submit, I couldn't even count. I didn't have a really great idea of what draft I was on, just because it's so constantly in flux. I call it tinkering, and my friends are always like, "Are you tinkering right now?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I can't help it. I'm always tinkering."
How hard was it the moment that you gave across the final copy? Were you like hanging on to it for dear life, not wanting to let it go?
I I sent it off, but up until literally I hit enter, I was still making changes. And then every time that my editor said, like, we're going into the next phase, I'd be like, okay, wait, I have a couple more changes, until she finally had to be like, this is the sign off copy. Like, we're about to go into print. You cannot change anything else. And
Uh,
actually I still ended up squeezing in like one last, like one or two last changes that are only in the ebook version, just because the book had already gone to print. So
I love that. I can totally relate to that as a writer. Yes, it's like, no, I can still make it better. Yes.
exactly.
So I'm interested in your advice for other writers. You've got a successful debut here. Many people are on the path to work out how to get there. What do
Yeah.
you advise other people who wanna write, who wanna get a beautiful novel like this into the world?
Well, I think the first thing would definitely be, and I'm not a font of wisdom, because I'm, like I said, like you said, and like I was saying, this is brand new to me. So I'm still in the getting advice from people phase of the process. But I think the first thing I would say is definitely, it's not too late. I mean, I think you have to keep saying that to people, because I can't tell you how many people I've met who are like, oh, I used to write, or I write, um, but I'm doing this other thing now, and I don't want to, I can't stop to write, or I can't take that time, or it's just too late. And I'm like, it's not too late. It's never too late to start it. It's it doesn't matter how long it takes, because when it's done and it's ready. So even if you can only dedicate an hour to it, every other night or a couple nights, for as many years as it takes, still try.
I like that. It's never too late. Yeah. I mean, we've had some writers on the podcast here who are in their 70s. I don't think we've had anyone in their 80s yet. Maybe that needs to be a new goal. But, people think, well, if I'm 75 and I haven't started, it's too late. It's like,
Yeah,
nope. We've had some very successful writers on the podcast who published their first book in their late 70s. So, yeah,
yeah,
why not?
yeah, yeah, exactly. It as long as you can continue to imagine things and write them down, you know, you still can do it.
So I'm interested in reading and books. Is there anything you can recommend that you would recommend to folks, or that you've read recently that was just beautiful and you enjoyed?
Well, okay, so the last thing, I just recently got into audiobooks, and the last thing that I read, I am a very late adopter of almost everything. That is something about me. I'm listening to and enjoying Beyonce albums from 10 years ago only now. But I just listened to Daisy Jones and the Six by Jenkins Reid, and it is performed by a full cast. And it was wonderful. It was everything that everyone had been saying it was. I went into it not exactly skeptical, but I just didn't expect to love it. Like I thought it was going to be a good read because I've read other things by Taylor Jenkins Reid and enjoyed them, but particularly the audiobook with that full cast, it's just it was such an enjoyable read. Um, Other things that I've read recently that I really liked, and again, a late adopter. So Circe by Madeline Miller, loved it. Uh, 5 years later. Um, I did read something new a few months ago. I read Matrix by Lauren Groff,
Ooh.
and
Mhm.
that was really good. And as I was reading, it was like just so beautiful, and I was awed by it, and I was just like, where the story is about a 13th century nun. I just was like, where would a
Wow.
woman in 2022, or when she wrote it, maybe 2020, have come up with this idea for this 13th century nun who's running this convent? It was
Wow.
just an amazing book.
Yeah, talk about, like, living someone else's life, right? Like,
Exactly.
yeah, wow. Well, before we wrap up and talk about where folks can connect with you, is there anything I missed or anything I didn't ask that you wanted to be sure to talk about?
I can't think of anything else. I am working on my second book. Hopefully we'll see it next year. Fingers crossed. um, but otherwise, no, I can't think of anything. This has been really fun.
Cool. And where can folks find you? Is there one particular place that you prefer to connect or hang out online?
I do tend to spend a lot of time on Instagram. I also am on Twitter, but I'm a little quieter on Twitter. Tend to just be reposting things on Twitter, retweeting. See, yeah, I also have a website, www.nouekirwan .com, so you can just see like little things. I have a playlist on there, Spotify playlist about of things that kind of put me in the mind of the book. So that's a little
Awesome.
fun. I think that's it, and a TikTok that there's absolutely nothing on.
I think a lot of authors have those these days. We're trying to work out like what to put on TikTok. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, we're there in case a reader wants to talk to us, but we're like, we don't know what we're doing here yet. But
Yeah.
yes, I can relate with a lot of TikToks that are experimental on my own. Well, that's lovely. And I will put on the episode page on bestofwomensfiction.com the links to all of your social media and the books that you recommended so folks can easily find that. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have you join us on the podcast. Thank you for
Thank
doing that. Thank
you.
you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.